Before I start this, I do want to point out that right now you can go to my brand new merch store and get some brand new beautiful merch for 15% off until the end of next week by using the code that you will find there. To get your mugs, your t-shirts, your phone cases, your sweaters, my chibbers. Also, before you ask, yes, this is unusual. I'm just trying to be visually distinctive for this kind of video where I tell you something about an interesting historical figure that has existed in history. The Friday video will have the bookshelf, which is over there, and it will be completely normal. It'll be about the 7 keys to immortality. Just giraffe with me while I test out this new format. Today we will talk about Junipero Serra, a Catholic priest and monk with extremely high power levels who was one of the driving forces that shaped California into the place that it is today. If you've watched Black Mirror, you might remember an episode entitled San Junipero, you know, the one with the virtual lesbians. San Junipero is not actually a city that exists. It is completely fictitious and meant to be fictitious as a stand-in for a generic California coastal city. And it is named for Junipero Serra, which, to be honest, I am surprised did not stir up a bit more controversy. For you see, Junipero Serra was a man of his time, which is a very nice way of saying, back in the day, nobody batted an eye at the fucked up shit he did, but if he did the same things today, we would send him to The Hague. But more on that later. Junipero Serra was born Miquel Josep Serra y Ferrer on the 24th of November 1713 in Petra, Mallorca, which is right here. I'll be honest with you, the primary motivation for me talking about this particular individual is because I used to live near this town when I was a child, and I found out about this very important historical figure that did massive things in world history on one of my many vacations to the island since. I went to primary school there, so I do kind of feel connected to the place. Serra's parents were farmers, so he learned a lot about agriculture very early on in his life, which is something that he would make use of later. However, from a very early age, he had a much greater interest in the local friary and the Catholic Church, specifically the singing part. He did supposedly have a fantastic voice, and the friars let him sing in the choir, and also solo to the community as a whole on special occasions. Though they were by no means wealthy, his parents worked very hard to enable Miquel to study at a proper university, such as the one in Palma, which is the capital of Mallorca, and he did study there when he was 16. After a year of studying philosophy, on the 14th of September 1730, Miquel Serra joined the Franciscan order as a novice. He was given the name Junipero, or Junipe, as the Catalonians would say. I might be using these interchangeably as the video goes on. At the tender age of 17, Junipero was very much engaged in a sort of hero worship. Not being the physically strongest of novices, he was more of a books guy, and very interested in stories about Catholic priests, missionaries in particular, who converted a lot of people and died as martyrs. By 1740, he was a fully ordained Catholic priest and taught philosophy at the convent of San Francisco, which is not the San Francisco in America, but a different San Francisco, not even a place called San Francisco, but a convent named after the actual Saint Francisco. But he would eventually go to reach San Francisco. Though his original course lasted only for 3 years, it ended up influencing a lot of very important missionaries. He was considered a bit of a genius and eventually attained a doctorate in theology. Meanwhile, the situation in his hometown had deteriorated. His parents had separated, which I did not know was something that you could just do in that particular period of time, and Petra, much like the rest of the island, had been hit by drought and pretty severe disease. He went back there occasionally, giving his parents money and almost watching both his father and his little sister die, which they didn't. While his parents were impoverished, illiterate farmers, Junipero had a bright future ahead of him. He was supposed to become a big shot in the Catholic Church, possibly going to the Vatican eventually, maybe even becoming Pope. But having read all those stories about martyrs and saints, Junipero had other plans. You see, the man had a very strange relationship with death. In a letter he sent his parents shortly before leaving for Mexico, it becomes clear that he saw death not as something that is terrible, but as a happy event, because it unites you with God. Now, most people would expect this from a priest or just really any religious person who genuinely believes that there is an afterlife, but even there, rarely people actually want to go and die. Serra almost worshipped death, celebrated it, saw it as the end of all worries. He had a similar view of pain and physical discomfort, which he saw as something that would strip people of their worldly hubris and bring them closer to God. He regularly engaged in self-flagellation and other things that would cause him pain. Not so much in the beginning of his ecclesiastical career, but he was known to whip himself in his cell at night, and he did have special clothes made for him that had spikes woven into the fabric, so he would always be in pain. This will come up later again, trust me on that. In 1749, Junipero Serra and a bunch of other Franciscan friars arrived in Mexico, which was New Spain at the time, but let's just call it Mexico to avoid confusion. And here we get to see how serious this guy is about being a Franciscan friar. All of the newly arrived missionaries were given horses to ride to Mexico City. Junipero, however, said no. Fuck you. I will not ride your horse. Francis of Assisi said that no Franciscan friar should ever ride a horse unless absolutely necessary, so I'm gonna go on foot. And not only did he travel this terribly long and arduous road by foot, but he also didn't have any money, and he didn't have any protection for him and the other guy he was traveling with. This went quite well for a while. Being men of God, they were lodged in the houses of the pious, they were given food when they ran into people, and to be honest, it might have been a very interesting road trip. Until one day, Junipero's foot started swelling, most likely due to an allergic reaction to a mosquito bite. He spent all night scratching it, which apparently 18th century intellectuals didn't yet know that you're not supposed to do that because it'll only make things worse. And it made it worse so much that his foot was essentially fucked forever. Here's how much of a machine this guy was, okay? According to Francis of Assisi, if a Franciscan friar is injured or infirm, or especially if he cannot walk, he can ride. Junipero didn't do that. He just kept on walking even though he couldn't physically walk properly. He walked all the way to Mexico City with his fucked up foot. When he joined his mates again, you know, the ones who had ridden on horseback in the College of San Fernando, he for some reason insisted that he would have to be a novice again and that he would have to once again experience this year of deprivation of anything good and proper, complete isolation from the outside of whatever institution he was in, and complete study and devotion to the sacred texts and ancillary books and literature. The college said, no, you are one of the smartest guys in this building and we are not going to allow you to pretend like you are one of the dumbest. Nevertheless, he did hang out with the novices most of the time, praying with them, eating with them, sleeping in one of their chambers, and also did all the jobs that the novices had to do because the people who had been part of the club for longer just didn't want to do them. This is also the phase where his physical self-punishment peaked. Once, when he was holding a sermon on sin, he just whipped out an iron link chain and started whipping himself with it in front of the entire congregation. Eventually, some dude walked up there, took the chain from Junipero, and began calling him a saint while whipping himself until he fucking died. Another thing that Junipero would do is hit his chest with a heavy rock during sermons, which later in life did cause him pretty severe breathing problems. This was by no means unheard of. Especially Franciscans were known for hurting themselves during sermons in acts of self-flagellation. However, Junipero Serra took it to a whole nother level. In the process of hurting himself so much that he actually would have problems with his health very long term, he broke many Franciscan guidelines who said, yeah, okay, whip yourself, but don't bleed to death, okay? So there was this mission in the Sierra Gorda, and all of the friars there died. Guess who was the first person to volunteer to replace them? Junipero arrived in the village of Jalpan, which was very deep in the territory of the Pame people. The Pame were a lot more relaxed when it came to having the Spanish be in their areas. Other groups like the Jonas and the Chimpeques really did not like the white man and their strange god. Serra really wanted to show them what it means to be a Christian, so he recreated the procession to Calvary, casting himself as Jesus. Despite his fucked up foot, he carried a very heavy cross through the countryside, preaching sermons about the suffering of Jesus whenever he could, and heavily involving the elders in the process to win over the rest of the Pame people. He was very successful in his endeavor to convert the Pame from their indigenous religion to Christianity, so much so that they eventually even gave him some of the idols that they had once worshipped to do with as he pleased. In all fairness, the Franciscans did introduce a lot of cool new stuff and technology to the region. Formerly, the Pame had not been much more than hunter-gatherers who did a little bit of agriculture. The Franciscans brought tools and farm animals, teaching the Pame all manner of agricultural and industrial skills. Through a formalized system of land ownership, they were able to give Pames who had converted to Christianity certain parcels of land to do with as they pleased, which is mostly to be used for the benefit of the mission. They kept the converted Native Americans strictly separated from the ones who still adhered to the old religion. They didn't consider them devil worshippers, but they did not want the good Christians they had created to fall back into their old ways. Because apparently missions are like rehab clinics for believing in the God that I don't believe in. All of the Christian natives living at the mission were also forced to perform hard labor, not necessarily in a slave type of way, but in a you must work hard to become a good Christian type of way. They were taught valuable skills, but they had to give up most of their freedom. There was also a lot of physical punishment for anyone who stepped out of line or engaged in behaviors that the Franciscans considered improper, which was pretty common at the time. But then came the soldiers. Well, in all fairness, the soldiers had already been there before, but they were outside of mission territory, working for the Spanish crown in hunting down indigenous rebels. The soldiers established a settlement for themselves and their families, and they saw the Franciscan mission, with all their native Pames people, to be very quaint and also indeed very illegitimate. They acted as though land owned by Christian Pames actually belonged to them, using it for their own farming purposes, and even forcing Pames who were Christians to work for them for little to no money. Junipero and his Franciscans were not very happy about this at all. They asked the Spanish crown to intervene, and Junipero, being Junipero, he instructed all of his friars to not eat as much and hunger, so they could experience what it was like to be one of the Pames who had their agricultural yields reduced. The soldier village was eventually told to fuck off by the Spanish crown, which they eventually also did, much later than they should originally have. And at that point, stability returned. Over the coming years, Junipero and his Christian Pames built this beautiful church in Jalpan, and also several other missions, stations, and churches in nearby towns. But then, something unexpected happened. They didn't come to the Sierra Gorda, mind you. No. This was Junipero Serra, who had gone to Mexico City, which was a trek that he did regularly despite his fucked up foot. He told the Inquisition officers that he wanted an inquisitor in the Sierra Gorda so he could fight the dangers of witchcraft. The Inquisition just said, yeah, okay, you're an inquisitor now. Congratulations, please go back to where you came from. You see, our buddy Juju here was seeing the devil everywhere, and he started incarcerating Christian Pames and also non-Pames people in his mission. One of the women that he had put in his Jesus jail eventually confessed that indeed devil worship was going on. Apparently there was a cabal of mostly non-native Christians in there who flew out to a nearby cave every night to worship a series of goat demons that would appear there. Junipero took this very seriously. There were incarcerations, flagellations, lots of death, the full Inquisition program, all to save the souls of these beautiful, innocent pagans. Eventually he went back to Mexico City, bouncing in between several positions, mostly working in church administration, but also going to rural areas for the Inquisition. Now we have to zoom out some more so we can talk about the globalists. The Jesuits were among the most powerful of orders within the Catholic Church, and they were a thorn in the side of worldly rulers because they were very non-worldly. Most Jesuits were not very interested in all these different kingdoms dancing the Jesus dance, Christian or no. There was a general interest in church officials governing areas, especially in the new colonies, directly, without the interference of all these nations. Considering that the Jesuits were very well connected to each other, had access to vast amounts of resources, and lacked many of the internal divides that other Catholic orders suffered from, the Portuguese, the French, and the Spanish soon came to see them as a threat to their hegemony. Spain was actually very late in joining this particular hype train, but the crown did come around to seeing the Jesuits as a threat when they instigated a minor revolt after a law was enacted that limited how broad sombreros could be. So in 1767, this funny-looking motherfucker expelled all Jesuits from all Spanish holdings. Many historians believe that this was just a move by a bunch of paranoid rulers to nib a problem in the bud before it could actually become a serious problem. There is little in the way of evidence that the Jesuits were actually planning some sort of clandestine global takeover. But then again, not 10 years later, a certain other empire lost 13 of its colonies because it failed to address the problems that had arisen there. I mean, they did also lose because they valued tea more than they did tobacco, so instead of dealing with the insurgents across the pond, they decided to focus their military efforts in Asia, resulting in a sort of half-assed attempt at the War of Independence. But they did lose, so does it really matter? Anyway, it's 1767, the Jesuits have been expelled from Mexico, and the Franciscans remain. One place is of particular interest to them: Baja California, which is that long peninsula underneath California that people like to forget the existence of. The Jesuits had been doing a lot of missionary work there for almost 100 years, and now that they were all gone, all the Jesus houses in the area were threatened with abandonment and disrepair. Junipero Serra was placed in charge of this particular operation, settling down in the former Jesuit compound in Loreto. The problem was that the friars could do all the preaching and converting that they wanted, but anything that went into administrative work, or really just anything that wasn't talking specifically, was handled by the military, which was still occupying the former Jesuit compounds. They even charged the Franciscans for the food that they provided without giving them the ability to grow their own food. That is, until in 1768, Visitador General José de Galvez inspected the former Jesuit holdings and expelled the military from them, handing them over to the Franciscans because the soldiers were dreadfully mismanaging the local resources. Now that he was in charge, Junipero began teaching the indigenous people of the area advanced agricultural techniques in order to be able to convert them to Christianity. Problem is, Baja California is extremely dry, and the natives were plagued with syphilis, which Serra's assistant, Francisco Palau, believed to be God's punishment for 2 Jesuits that they had killed 30 years earlier. To the north, though most of California was technically under Spanish control, most of the indigenous people were not Christians and very much adhered to their old faiths and traditions. Plus, there was the ever-present threat of the Russians, who could descend from Alaska at any moment to bring some chiquibriqui to the place. So José de Galvez decided to mount an expedition into the nice part of California, and before he was even finished with his offer, Junipero accepted his role as the leader of that endeavor. Remember the leg thing? Yeah, that shit had begun to fester a lot, and Junipero was barely able to walk. A lot of people, especially his friends, recommended that he stay behind in Loreto and let them handle all the going north and the difficult trekking and the converting of the natives. Junipero was not a fan of this idea, considering that converting vast swathes of Native Americans to Christianity was a bit of a childhood dream of his. So he told the main corpus of the expedition to just go ahead, and he would catch up with them after having healed up for a while. A week later, he proceeded to go on a trek through one of the most arid regions in the entire world, subsisting on nothing but dry bread and old cheese. He did ride on this journey though, because his leg was at this point so utterly destroyed that he could not physically use it for locomotion. Oh, and also instead of riding a horse like a normal person, he rode a geriatric mule. On his way north, he held masses and sermons wherever he could, even if it was just in some random field, or for the 2 people he was traveling with, which is a manservant and a soldier. He met up with Gaspar Portola, whom he had placed in charge of the main body of the convoy in Santa Maria, and then convinced him to let him travel ahead with some of the friars to the now non-existent town of Velicata, so he would be there in time for the Pentecost. Then, finally, on the 14th of May 1769, Junipero Serra founded his very first own mission, the Misión San Fernando Rey de España de Velicata, which also does not exist anymore. The ceremony on the site where they founded the mission was a bit ghetto. It was just basically they had no incense, and so the soldiers fired in the air a bunch of times, so they used the smoke as incense. After some days of the mission existing, a group of natives came there to see what all the fuss was about, and Junipero Serra experienced a fairly severe culture shock. You see, the local Native Americans were naked, and not for a lack of being able to make clothes, but just because they wanted to be. In spite of being very surprised and maybe a little bit irritated by this, Junipero initiated an exchange of gifts and told them to tell their families that the mission was now open to them. The tribal chief was legitimized in the name of the King of Spain because, you know, all the previous tribal chiefs who hadn't gotten that particular blessing from a monarch halfway across the world hadn't been legitimate somehow. Soon after, the expedition got back on its feet. Except Junipero, who literally couldn't even stand. Portola told him to go back to the mission, just heal up there, you will catch up with us again. But Junipero said, no, I shall not, and if I die on this journey, just put me in the ground somewhere and it will have been God's will. He really was not afraid of dying. For a while, Junipero was carried around on a stretcher by some of the Christian natives that were with the expedition, but he soon developed a guilty conscience and asked someone in the caravan to whip up some medicine for him. And this is a big deal because normally Junipero was not a big fan of medicine. And the guy said, dude, I only make medicine for animals. This is not humans' medicine. And Junipero responded, well, I don't give a shit, just give me the animal medicine. And he did, and the next day Junipero was walking again, telling everyone that though the leg itched, it didn't hurt anymore. As they continued north, they passed through a bunch of Native American villages, and all of them did seem fairly nice and fascinated with Junipero in particular. Despite the fact that no conscious effort to recruit these natives was being made, the convoy grew bigger. They had lost a lot of people, and they would lose a lot of people over their trek, but many natives were joining them in their journey. Junipero interacted with them every night, exchanging gestures of friendship, trying to teach them Christian rituals, and also one time he almost got his glasses stolen. He did definitely look down upon them with a certain amount of condescension. To him and his Christian colleagues, the Native Americans were essentially savage children that needed to be educated in the right ways of God. And though Junipero engaged in a lot of fucked up practices over the years, few people doubt that he actually did love the people that he had converted like they were his own children. On the 1st of July, after a long and arduous journey, the expedition finally arrived in San Diego. A lot of people had died, a lot of people were sick, but the only guy who had been sick from the beginning of the expedition, which was Junipero, was alive and kicking. They also had to deal with one of their supply ships being struck with scurvy, so that became a problem. Recovery would take a while, and Junipero used this time to found his second mission, this one called Misión Basílica San Diego de Alcalá. However, the natives of this region, the Kumeyaay, were not as accepting of Christianity as many of the other natives group that Junipero had encountered over the years. They also had no idea just how powerful guns are. They just sort of walked up to soldiers, a lot of which were still injured or suffering from the scurvy, and they laughed at them, and they taunted them, and some even engaged in mild physical bullying. Gunshots fired in the air usually drove them away, and they would only really see how devastating firearms could be about a month later, when they decided to attack the Feast of the Assumption. That's the celebration where the Virgin Mary sort of went to heaven, body and all. It was 20 Kumeyaay warriors against 5 Spaniards, one of whom wasn't even a soldier. But the Spanish did have guns, so they won, and miraculously, at least according to Junipero, nobody died except his own manservant, who was hit in the neck with an arrow. Of course, Junipero had been praying for 0 casualties on both sides. In reality, though, several of the native warriors did die. As for why they attacked the mission, I mean, imagine just some dudes, they come rolling into your area, and they start using your land as though it were theirs, and they bring in foreign animals that immediately begin wreaking havoc on your native ecosystem, and also they try to convert you to their weird religion. Would you not at least be slightly pissed? After the mission had been fortified and the dead buried, Junipero befriended a young Kumeyaay boy who had also, before the attack, been very interested in Christianity. He taught the child Spanish and instructed it to get him a baby that he could baptize. Baptizing babies has a very important symbolic meaning among Franciscans. Sometime after this, a group of Kumeyaay did indeed come to bring him a baby that he could baptize. Junipero was above the clouds with happiness that he had finally broken through to these people, and he officiated a huge ceremony for this very festive event. However, just as he was about to pour the holy water over the baby's head, the Kumeyaay grabbed the baby and ran away laughing. Junipero did not find this very amusing. After several more months and a general consensus that their mission to convert the natives to Christianity had failed, Junipero and most of the people in his original expedition got on a ship to Monterey, which is even farther to the north. They were blown massively, of course, twice, supplies were running dry, the sea was being an absolute and thorough bitch to them, half of the crew contracted scurvy again, and also everyone was constantly fearing for their lives for 6 weeks. Junipero described this journey as somewhat uncomfortable. On the 3rd of June 1770, also on Pentecost, Junipero Serra and his mates founded the Misión de San Carlos Borromeo de Carmelo in Monterey. This time the ceremony was a bit more lavish. Turns out though that the area is shit for agriculture and there's very few natives living there. So having a mission is ineffective and also sort of pointless. So they had to relocate it. Also, Spanish soldiers were raping Native American women living in the mission, and Junipero couldn't do anything about it because he couldn't ask the commander to intervene because him and the commander were on very bad terms after Junipero had told the commander to not be so harsh with his soldiers. The new Misión Carmel, relocated to a much better area, became the new permanent home and base of operations for the 58-year-old Junipero, and he went on to found 7 more missions from 1771 to 1782. Eventually, Felipe de Neve, the governor of Las Californias, tried to introduce more Enlightenment-style ideas to the process of conversion of the natives, which is something that had worked in many other Spanish holdings. But Junipero resisted this and also all of the other complications that de Neve, who really did not like him, threw his way, because he controlled some very important agricultural assets that were helping new settlers getting settled and also were helping established settlements not starve to death. In other words, most of the settlements in de Neve's California were dependent upon supplies from the Franciscans and Junipero, and he had absolutely no qualms in leveraging this power in order to fulfill his spiritual agenda. Despite not being a bishop, Junipero was given the ability to administer confirmations, which are like extra rituals and double baptisms for adult Catholics. You know, people in Catholic churches who go up to the altar and eat the cookie and drink the wine, aka they take the Holy Communion? Those are people that have gone through confirmation. Aged 67, he traveled all over California to all of the missions he had founded in order to administer confirmations to all of the people that had been baptized there. Because of his fucked up leg and his breathing complications, this was physically excruciating for him. But he did not stop. On the 28th of August 1784, at this point 70 years old, despite a life of severe physical punishment, Junipero Serra died in his mission in what is now known as Carmel by the Sea, California, leaving behind an at the time venerated and more presently controversial legacy. The missions he had founded undeniably brought modern technology and education to Native American populations, but at what cost? Junipero and his Franciscan friars treated the Native Americans like children. Literally so, they referred to them as children in many of their texts. And corporal punishment was a very common practice in order to educate your children properly back in the day. The missions were, at the end of the day, fancy prisons that isolated a lot of people from the rest of their cultures, strategically and slowly destroying and displacing those very same cultures. Now, Junipero Serra is a saint of the Catholic Church, and you might say, of course he is. Back in the day, everyone who converted a bunch of natives was made a saint. Thing is, he was not made a saint in the 18th or 19th century, but in 2015 by Big Papa Francis himself in Washington, D.C. A lot of people, especially Native American academics, were very angry about this and tried to stop it. On the other hand, a lot of people from tribes that Junipero had converted voiced their strong support for his canonization, Eventually, some of them even attended and read passages from the Bible in their native languages. There's a statue of him in the US Capitol, and it was supposed to be removed and replaced, but pressure from especially Hispanic Catholics ensured that this did not happen. Any way you look at it, Junipero Serra was an incredibly devout man who truly believed the things he preached. His methods are certainly questionable, and I would argue terrible, but so were the methods of everyone else at the time. I suppose this falls back to the question as to whether or not we should judge people by modern standards, which, to be honest, I don't think we should, but there are very good arguments to say that we should. Then also the other question arises, are we going to treat everyone across the board like that? And are we going to begin demonizing Genghis Khan as the mass murderer that he was? But what do you think about all of this, or any ancillary topics that you might have a strong opinion on? Please leave it down in the comments. I would actually genuinely love to see it. Thank you very much for watching. Do not forget to like and also subscribe to this video. Consider supporting me on Patreon. You will get very, very cool rewards, especially on the Discord server, which you should definitely join. Try getting some merch if you like it. If you don't like it, don't get merch. But right now, there's a 15% off promotion, so, consider it. In that spirit, do not get converted by missionaries that stroll into your town, or maybe do. I can't tell you what to believe or what not to believe. And see you around, cunts.